everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here. So if you're standing out there, why don't you wander in or wander away, your choice. No, but seriously, come on in. It'll be exciting. So the night sessions have been working out just in terms of helping to keep some of the more academic, historic stuff for people that have that focus, and it's helped make the sermons a little bit lighter, I hope. And I want to do the same thing. So normally when you do a book series, which we're about to be starting a book series going through the Gospel of Matthew, you tend to give a lot of sort of historical background, cultural background, all of that kind of stuff. And I thought, wouldn't it just be fun? Churches don't just do like a background to the New Testament. So I'm going to kind of do just a very broad, here's the background of the New Testament world, and then I'm going to focus a little bit on Matthew, so that hopefully starting next week, I just start preaching Matthew. That's my goal. So here we go. I want to talk a little bit about the social and political context, or we're just going to start here, the social political context of the first century world. Now, a lot of what we know about this come from two primary sources. One of that is from the works of Josephus. He was a Jewish general that actually fought the Romans. If you're familiar with the story of Masada, where everybody commits suicide and the last person stacks the bodies up and then kills himself. It was going to be a similar kind of thing, and it was down to him and one other person at the very end, and he finally goes, hey, what if we actually don't finish this, and what if we just go out and play nice? And that's what he did, and the Romans actually let him live and employed him, believe it or not. So he was under the employ of the Roman Empire to write about the culture, to help them understand who were they fighting, and also to write about the various battles kind of from his insider perspective. So from a Roman standpoint, he represented the Jews. To the Jews, he obviously represented the Romans. So he wrote quite a bit about this time period, so primarily from Jewish antiquities and Jewish war. But the other side is there's an apocryphal book, which we talked about in the What is the Bible series, and that's 1st and 2nd Maccabees. This is, it contains a lot of information about this time period as well. More recently, there's been a lot of archaeological digs and other kinds of things, but still, these are the two kind of main sources. So if you think of the closing of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament, there's about 400 years between these two events. And so let's just start off with what happens during this time. And there's three main things, at least in view of New Testament studies. Number one is the unification of Greek culture. So Hellenism is kind of the word that's used to signify this is Greek culture. And so Hellenization is the spread of this culture. So Greek culture itself, the Greek language itself, kind of united, at least intellectually, a lot of the world at the time, to the degree that even when they were conquered by Rome, Rome, in large part, their philosophy was largely borrowed from, even their mythology was largely borrowed from the Greeks. They liked theirs better, and they kind of just took the Greek names and renamed it with their own names and made it their own stories. And so Rome is essentially a very well-organized fan fiction of Greek culture. But the Greek language became just the common tongue of the world at the time. It was precise, it was very accurate. If you do any medical studies today, you have to study a ton of Greek. Perhaps as much as seminary students have to study. And so a lot of our English words are built on Greek words, so even today we're feeling its influence. But the second main thing is there was a unification of Roman politics. And so the Roman Empire was vast, and one of the things they did, they were builders. They built roads everywhere they went. And so these roads enabled journeys that used to be impossible to become much more realistic. And they built cities everywhere they went. And so you could go kind of to any Roman city and you would find a very similar kind of structure with sort of a central colonnade. You would find a theater, thus you would get the Greco-Roman culture kind of brought to you. You would find a kind of velodrome or a hippodrome for like horse racing and that kind of thing. And so they were exporting their culture as well. But with this came Pax Romana, or the Peace of Rome. There was a whole Roman set of laws. And so we think in terms of country because that's the way our world exists. But the ancient world was not this way. You essentially had city-states, and then in a few particular places and time periods, you had vast empires that kind of consumed these city-states. So if you think of, imagine the United States where every single city had a completely different set of a code of laws, it would be impossible to travel through the country without getting yourself into trouble. Well, the Roman Empire essentially provides one fixed set of laws for everybody in all circumstances. And so this helped travel. It helped know you had basic protection, rights, responsibilities, et cetera. And so these two things from the Romans actually helped bring the world together in a way that you used to not be able to enjoy for fear of being robbed on the way or, just getting prosecuted when you went somewhere for not knowing what was happening. And then finally, there were some unique things to Judaism. The synagogues came into view during the exile, during those 400 years. And this was because as the Jews were deported out of Israel, they no longer had access to the temple itself. And so everywhere they went, they started houses of worship. So some of the oldest synagogues in the world are in places like Yemen, in places like Iran, places like Iraq. And these are places where the Jews scattered either before the time of Christ or after the time of Christ once the Romans came through there. And they essentially brought the synagogues everywhere they went. We see in the book of Acts where the apostles kind of stop one every city they went to, stop in the synagogue. Stop two, when that didn't work, go to the marketplace. And that was just kind of their pattern. So synagogues just became a very real part of their worship. Now remember, when you lose the temple, you're not just losing the temple, you're losing the sacrificial system. So if you have a system of religion that's built around covering your sin, and you had the temple, which kind of provided that, and now you don't, you have a bit of a problem. It would kind of be like being Catholic and needing the Mass, but not having a priest and a church in which to perform the Mass. So if that really is necessary, you're kind of up a creek. And so because of this, the synagogues emphasized teaching, they emphasized worship. In fact, a lot of New Testament, us included, sort of service style is largely patterned after synagogue worship, especially in the first century. But the second thing was the oral law became a very real component of their worship and their understanding. They're removed from the temple, they're removed from all of these documents. A lot of them are destroyed or lost during this time. Not all of them, but the average person didn't have access to this, and so they basically created what is known as the oral law. This is what the young children would learn at school. They would be able to recite this, and so you hear Jesus say, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." Well, he's referencing something in the oral law. When we start talking about the different sects, S-E-C-T-S, the different sects of Judaism, we'll see some of them accept the oral law, others reject the oral law, and so it's fascinating. But the oral law largely is built around 1 Samuel 15:22, which says, "To obey is better than sacrifice." And so because of them going into the exile, they were trying to learn their lesson of how did we get into the exile? Let's make sure we never do that again. Let's really study the law and let's focus on that. And then finally, Aramaic becomes the lingua franca of the day. Hebrew was limited kind of just to reading the scriptures. And this separation between Hebrew and Aramaic meant that the average person might have some misunderstandings with the text or might have some misunderstandings with Judaism. When we were touring Israel, where were we? We were in Galilee, and our tour guide was saying that people, I forgot what document he was quoting, he was saying people from that area were prohibited from reading in the temple because their reading was so poor. And one of the synagogues we went in had like certain objects from other religions, so like lots of syncretism was happening, mixing with religions. And so it was fascinating to see that our understanding of this sort of puristic Judaism is not quite as central or not quite as realistic as we might hope to believe. But a lot of this is due just to linguistics. As people switch from Hebrew to Aramaic, it's the same thing for the Catholic Church that used to be in Latin. And if you're in Latin and nobody speaks Latin anymore, you just memorize the prayers and then you don't understand what's being said. So you either live with that misunderstanding or you have to make a language change. Now, if you're reading the New Testament, the majority of the Old Testament quotes in the New Testament, they're not quoting actually from the Hebrew, the Masoretic text. They are quoting from the Greek, the Septuagint. And so they're quoting from that translation. So I'm just going to flash a couple of different pictures of various empires here, and you're going to see how the same strip of land gets used again and again. So this would be kind of early Bible times. This is the Middle Bible times. This is the Babylonian Empire. This is where things would have started during those 400 years. And so it's just kind of modern day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. This same piece of land becomes the Persian Empire. This is about 500 years. We went through a lot of this in our Daniel series recently. The same piece of land becomes the Greek Empire after that. And so we see it, the borders change ever so slightly. And then there's the Roman Empire. This is at the time of Julius Caesar, who died in 44 BC. And so, if you think of Israel as largely where the Gospels are formed, well, Israel and Egypt, because Jesus went to Egypt. Early in Acts, we get a little bit of time in Israel, but the majority of the focus in Acts goes to where? They're headed to Turkey and headed to Greece. And Paul makes it as far as Rome. We're not told so explicitly in the text, but that's where it was headed, and church tradition tells us that. Speaking of Paul in Europe, shameless plug, if you're looking for something to do next summer and you would like to just get some hands-on, eyes-on experience, we have a church group going next year. There's flyers out back going to Turkey and Greece to see kind of the biblical sites. So I'm just planting that bug. You can come see all of this for yourself. It'll be super cool. So during this time, 150 years or so before the time of Christ, there's this group, it's a family called the Maccabees. They are responding to one character named Antiochus Epiphanes. That means, his name essentially means God manifest. He was attempting to unite his own empire, and he sends one of his generals to collect taxes, to outlaw Judaism, and essentially to enforce paganism. This is in response to him feeling like they've rejected him in a particular moment where they thought he was dead, and they kind of took back over some space. But he forced Jews to eat pork. He made pagan sacrifices. He killed people who circumcised their children or did other outward shows of Judaism. He plundered the temple. He held orgies in the temple. He sacrificed to pagan gods in the temple. And so it was a very real, in-your-face deconstruction of we have the power and we're going to make you do those things you don't want to do. That's what they did. In response to this, there's this guy named Mattathias, and he is an elderly priest. He was ordered to sacrifice one of these pigs, and he refuses to, and so his kind of second in command steps up and says, well, I'll do that. And Mattathias says, no, you won't. And he killed him, and he killed the guy that was sent by Antiochus, and this kind of started, where do you go with that? You now have to own the strategy of killing, and so they gathered out in the wilderness, out in the hill country, and they banded together and started opposing Antiochus. Fascinating, Matthew 5 starts with Jesus went out into the wilderness, he went up on a hill. Do you wonder if many of the people of that day might have thought, was he simply going to be the next in the line of the Maccabees and oppose? Perhaps. And so his son is named Judas, also known as the Hammer. He gathers them out in the wilderness as well. He defeats these armies, and this triggers a war, an internal war, though. Once they won victory from the Syrians, that's who Antiochus represented, once they won this victory, it was not just all a great love affair inside of Israel. You now had internal schism, and so you had very pro-Hellenistic, very pro-Greek, and anti-Hellenistic Jews that's essentially kind of turned to a bit of a civil war at one point. They gain a brief moment of independence under his other sons, Jonathan and Simon. They gain political power essentially by contending by playing off the various Syrian rulers against each other. And then finally they gained their independence. They even actually had a treaty with Rome at one point. And so all of this was just a very brief blip in their history of independence, but essentially all of the infighting, it weakens their rule. And then the Romans come in and they subjugate everybody in 63 BC, and the Romans stay there until basically they kill all of the Jews and kick them out in 70. But all of this, if you're an oppressed people and you have all these messianic texts and you've already returned from exile, and now there seems to be this leader who randomly gets a rabble of guys together, and you kick out the powers that be and you make a treaty with like the real next in line reigning power, superpower of the day, it feels like you're making progress in a certain direction, right? It feels like maybe Messiah is about to be here, or maybe he could be one of us. And so there's just this hopeful expectation that as these things are happening, as these unfathomable battles are being won against superior forces, that it seems like God is fighting on our side. I mean, go read through Joshua, the way that God fought on their side. There's just this excitement. If you look at the fall of Jerusalem around AD 70, you'll actually see a similar sort of feeling. I'll talk about the zealots in a moment, but there's that sense of feeling. So in the time of Christ specifically, we have Herod the Great. He's an Edomite, so the Edomites come from Esau. Because of this, he's not quite Jewish. I mean, he sort of puts the ish in Jewish. He's from the other brother, and he's not from the line of Jacob. And because of this, they don't like him at all. He's also trying to control this area, and from a Jewish perspective, it would seem like he's doing the bidding of Rome, who we don't like. And then from a Roman perspective, it would seem kind of like he was sort of pro-Jewish. So he was kind of caught in the middle. He placated the Jews, but he absolutely hated them. So he would do things like not eating pork. He beautified the temple, but he absolutely hated the Jews. There was a real sense of rejection that he felt from them. He was a very bloody person, killed many, many, many members of his family. And he was just afraid that they were rising up and going to take the throne. And so they said it was better to be his pig than his son. In Greek, the words for pig and son it's a play on words. But if you were his pig, he didn't eat pork, and so you're safe. If you were his son, chances are you would wind up on the chopping block at some point. He commanded a slaughter at the time of his death. And he said, even if there's not crying over my death, there will be crying at my death. This was a command that was given, but wisely not followed later. And so that kind of sets some of the social and the political side up. Let's turn our attention to look at some of the religious and the cultural context. And so with each of these next several slides, I want you to kind of listen for modern day parallels, because almost without exception, there is some kind of group that is represented by these groups in today's world. And so the first of these are some Greco-Roman philosophies that were around in the day. The first of these is Gnosticism. This is something that a lot of the letters either implicitly or explicitly are addressing certain elements of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is built around the Greek word gnosis, which is where we get our word knowledge from. And for them, it was a secret knowledge. This is a very elitist, secretive kind of club. They were sort of like the Scientologists of the day. But they taught that matter is evil. Essentially, there is a God, and then there's a series of demigods, and because matter is evil, the world is not created by the ultimate good one. It's created by one of these lower and lower ones. Whenever you think that matter is evil, you have one of two responses. You either become very ascetic, meaning you deny all pleasure, you say no to all kinds of pleasure, or you become very libertine. And so you have people who are Gnostic who are completely denying everything. In one of Paul's letters, he says, people will say, do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. These have a form of godliness, but no real power. That was the ascetic side of Gnosticism. Or there's the very libertine. If it feels good, do it. And so that's an easy selling point with a lot of people. The next philosophical group are the Stoics. The Stoics believed that the world was infused, that all matter was infused with a kind of world soul. Essentially, this is pantheism, that God is everything. And they believed in, so we use the word stoic to mean someone is in control of their emotions. This was actually central to their philosophy. Fate has determined everything, and you need to know what you can and cannot control. And you need to accept it. Like if you're going to die at 25 and you know this somehow, there's no sense in crying about it. It's just a fact of life, and you just need to accept it and move on. If your child dies early on, well, you can't change that. Just accept it and move on. So it has this kind of heartless feel to it. They want to avoid all extremes of emotion by focusing on reason. And so reason is higher than emotion. Some of the early European racism against Africans is actually rooted in Stoicism. Because Europeans at that time are kind of well-fed on this sense of rationalism. So rationalism comes back to us through René Descartes and other Enlightenment and even post-Enlightenment thinkers. And so that, like, this kind of rationalism sticks with Western culture for a long time. And so if you think, well, reason is the highest order, the highest form of being, and emotionalism, this is the lowest, and then you cross cultures with cultures that value the exact opposite, where you're supposed to be emotional, in kind of the worst cross-cultural misunderstanding from the European standpoint, you look and you say, well, these people are not fit for self-rule. They can't even rule themselves, so how can they rule their own societies? So a lot of that line of thinking is actually largely built out of this philosophical camp. Epicureanism is the next philosophy. These were largely materialistic. Materialistic, not in the sense of likes to have lots of stuff, but in the sense of what we would call in modern day world just being evolutionary, to think that it's matter and the void. So they believed kind of in deism. They wouldn't reject that God existed at all, but they would say the gods are unknowable. They essentially might have made the world, but they're not at all part of it. You can't know them. Don't worry about it. So for Epicureanism, pleasure became ultimate. The famous phrase, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, that is from Epicurean philosophy. Now, when we think of pleasure being ultimate, we typically just assume, well, we're talking about pure hedonism. But it's not just hedonism that they're talking about. To the Greeks, pleasure has this higher form, which would involve things like deep friendships and relationships, strong family ties, strong culture and sense of identity, and cultural experiences, things like the arts, and this sort of higher form of pleasure. So it is a focus on pleasure, but not merely carnal pleasure. Certainly probably part of it, but we shouldn't reduce it to that. Paul encountered both Stoics and Epicureans in Athens. And so if you read that in Acts chapter 17, these are some of the people that he's interacting with, are these two groups specifically. The next group is Cynicism, or Cynics. They led, these were the hippies, or maybe the grunge culture, to be a little bit more specific to here. They led very vulgar and unkempt lives, from, terrible hairstyles, wearing dirty clothes, using vulgar language, performing lewd acts in public, defecating in public, just kind of breaking all social conventions, feeling no need to fit a social norm. They also rejected wealth, and because of this, they had to beg. So they would go begging. If you remember, Paul talks about him and the other apostles. They said, we did not come begging. We came and we worked. We supported ourselves. Other places he taught, if any man doesn't work, neither shall he eat. Well, he's interacting. He's trying to show, look, I'm not a cynic philosopher that's going around begging. This one has some obvious parallels in today's world. And then skeptics. We use this just as an adjective to describe someone who doesn't believe, but this is actually a formal first century philosophical camp. And of course, they believed that there was no absolute truth. However, they rejected dogmatism. So they were not dogmatic about there being no absolute truth. So they weren't what we would call atheists. They're essentially the agnostics of the first century. And so obviously there's some of that as well floating around. Let's look at Greco-Roman religions. And so again, think about parallels to this. The first is there was a strong sense of mythology. You have all the, the Greek stuff that you read about in high school, Zeus, who's the head of the pantheon. You have Poseidon, the ruler of the sea, Hades, the ruler of the underworld. This is leading up to this time, and at a surface level, these things would stick around for a couple hundred more years in the 1st and 2nd century. As Rome began to crumble, there was this movement of make Rome great again, and it was the sentiment was, do you remember back when we were all Roman and we all worshiped the Roman gods and everything was fine, and then there were all these other religions that are now all over the place. Let's get rid of these other religions and let's kind of reify being Roman and what it means to be Roman. But by and large, in terms of like real belief, mythology had largely kind of phased itself out. Honestly, kind of in favor of state religion. So state religion in the Roman Empire is a huge thing, to worship the state. This is such a big deal that there's a lot of modern New Testament scholars right now. If you ever hear the phrase anti-imperial, if you listen to any N.T. Wright, he uses this phrase like every other sentence. But if you hear anti-imperial or anti-imperialism, it's to say, like you would pledge your allegiance to Caesar, and this is true. You would pledge your allegiance to Caesar by saying Caesar is Lord. He is the dominant one. He is the ruler of all, right? He is Lord. And so to say early Christian baptism, you would come out of the water and you would say Jesus is Lord. You'd pledge lordship to Jesus and not Caesar. And so somebody like N.T. Wright would say, okay, our confession of faith is against the empire. I hear what he's saying. I don't know that I worded exactly that way, but state religion was in fact a huge thing, and as a subset of this, we have emperor worship. So the Senate started deifying the Caesars after their death. Julius Caesar, he's the first one that this happens to. He is deified in 44 BC after his death, and this starts a long and obviously problematic transition of thinking of the Caesars either after their death and then later in their earthly form as divine. This coin right here that you see, this is for Caesar Augustus. You might be able to make out those words. Caesar Augustus, and essentially that divus word on the backside of the coin means divine. Caesar Augustus was the first one who tries to declare himself divine. And then after that, there's several others that kind of step in line with this. He is the Caesar when Jesus was born. And so you just have to factor that in. I have his birth announcement here. This was uncovered, I want to say in the late 80s or early 90s. It says, since Providence, which has ordered all things and is deeply interested in our life, has set its most perfect order by giving us Augustus, whom she filled with virtue, that he might benefit humankind, sending him as a savior, both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things. And since he, Caesar, by his appearance, excellence, excelled even our anticipations, surpassed all previous benefactors, and not even leaving to posterity any hope of surpassing what he has done. So essentially, he's like number one, and no one else is going to be number one after him. And since the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good tidings for the world that came by reason of him. Mark 1:1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. How fascinating. The birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning. It's the same Greek word as the beginning used there in Mark. He's the beginning of the good tidings. Good tidings, this is our word for good news. So like you could just see how much essential worship right here is in this birth announcement for Caesar Augustus. This is the guy who is Caesar when Jesus is born. Outside of emperor worship, there is some there's mystery cults, mystery religion. There are things such as, we don't know all of them because they're mysterious, but people find paintings or inscriptions on rocks about this stuff, but not really enough to have a clear picture. Probably the one that they know the most about, because it was very popular with the Roman soldiers, this was Mithraism. And so Mithraism was kind of a power cult. Power cults are actually still a thing in today's world. There's a cult in Mexico where they invite a demon to possess them, and because it gives them power, they think it makes them bulletproof. And so if you're part of the cartel, like you go through these rituals essentially to make you bulletproof against the police and the federales and everybody else. So this concept exists today in today's world. Even certain singers, singer-songwriters, they have claimed to have turned them. Some overtly claim this, some hinted in their music and leave the door open to if they have done this or not, but they claim to have, like, they get their creativity from some kind of demonic force. I'm not saying a demon is actually giving them song lines. I'm just saying that's what they're saying. But mystery religions are big things. So Romans used this as a power cult. Essentially, a Roman soldier, they would dig a pit. The Roman soldier would be in the pit. They would bring a bull over the pit. You'd take a sword, stab it, and then all the blood would, essentially it was a baptism of sorts. And so the pit is representing your grave. You get the power of the bull in trade for your death. So there's kind of a reimagined death experience there, which is interesting when we think about baptism being us representing going under the water and being raised anew with Christ. Sex cults were a real thing. If you're wondering if that is a penis bird mobile, like for a baby's thing, yes, that is a penis bird mobile. I saw this at a museum in Houston. They had this whole exhibit. And I mean, how do you see that and not take a picture? Because no one would believe that you saw it. So yeah, sex cults were a huge thing in the Roman world and the Greek world. If you go tour these ancient cities, like you'll see phalluses scribbled into rocks and all kinds of stuff. Unlike the modern world that tends to hide these or be a little bit prudish about this kind of stuff, they just had no qualms about this whatsoever. And then finally, magic. Magic was a big deal for them, particularly in Ephesus. In the book of Ephesians, magic is a huge, huge deal. Magic is the attempt to manipulate forces or spirits, powers, spirit beings, to providing in some way for a practitioner. If you think about the religions that teach fate, you have your fate and you just have to accept it. Your kid died, just accept it and don't even cry about it, just move on. Well, that doesn't cut it for most people. Most people want an explanation. Most people want to try to save their child or save their marriage or have good crops this year. And in the absence of certain scientific explanations or modern farming, it's hard to make sure that those things happen. And so magic becomes kind of the vehicle that people would use. Can we circumvent the gods' and goddesses' will? Can we circumvent fate by performing some kind of ritual, by making the right appeal? So oftentimes magic is used to gain protection, or sometimes it's used to put a curse on one's enemies to ensure fertility or prosperity, or even to know or try to figure out the future. These were very, very common things, often would happen in conjunction with other pagan rituals or with other pagan centers like the certain temples and such. In Ephesus, there was so much of that going on, from wearing amulets, using magical names as protectants, using curses, all this kind of stuff was just rampant. This is why Ephesians talks so much about principalities, powers, dominions, ruler, all those things. Paul just keeps kind of going through those words again and again. But then in Acts, the account there is you see magic all over Acts, but you see magic especially when they go into Ephesus. That was the place where it said they burned their books, and they give you the dollar amount for what it was worth. Next, we have Jewish sects. The first of these, and probably the most well-known by the average reader, are the Pharisees. Again, there's modern parallels to all of these. So the Pharisees or their predecessors started during the exile, and they get a really bad rap, but they were seeking a good thing. If law breaking and if idolatry is what got us out of our country, what put us at odds with God, it put us on his disciplinary list, let's make sure we never do that again. I mean, that's a good aspiration. And so they are trying to answer, how do we make sure we never do this? They adhered to the Mosaic law. They adhered to the oral law. These were perhaps we don't know exactly where the oral law came about, but these are perhaps the people that helped create this. We do know that they started adding to the laws. So like if God says, don't commit adultery, you'll never commit adultery if you're never in the same room with a woman by yourself. And so they start essentially hedging in God's law. If God says don't work on the Sabbath, well, you'll never work on the Sabbath if you never take X many steps outside of your house, if you never cook on certain extra rules that aren't in the Old Testament, they kind of helpfully fill in so that if you keep those, you'll be sure to keep God's original law. They absolutely hated Hellenization. They hated the Greek culture, the Roman culture being in there. They considered themselves to be separated ones. Again, they get a bad rap, but you've got Nicodemus, you've got Joseph of Arimathea. Both of these are Pharisees and seem to be very faithful men, very hopeful, expectant, believing men. And so sometimes we paint with a broad brush about the Pharisees, but there were some good points as well. The Sadducees, this was a different group. If people know a little bit more than just the Pharisees, normally it's this group because the Sadducees and the scribes get mentioned quite a bit by Jesus. They were the opposite of the Pharisees, right? So they are very politically connected and very powerful. They had started off being very anti-Hellenization, but at some point they recant this policy in trade for some power. Because of this, they were very, very powerful. They ran kind of the temple grounds. These are the people who charged money for changing. They did the money changing in the temple. They affirmed only the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. They affirmed only that as being inspired. So they did not follow the oral law, and they didn't even really follow the writings and the prophets as well. So just the books of Moses was what they were focused on. Then we have the Essenes. The Essenes, they're not actually named by name in the New Testament, but we're aware largely from Josephus. These are the ones who actually, the Dead Sea Scrolls were most likely written by them. It was found in one of their caves, so we assume that they were the ones who wrote. The whole community by the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community, that's one of the only known monasteries of them that we have. Some of them mixed in to broader culture, but they live very, very separate lives. So they were very disgruntled by politics and very disgruntled by Hellenistic culture. They didn't want any of these things. They just wanted to kind of isolate. And so that's why you sometimes see them living out in the desert. They very much focused on the end times to the degree, the end times being, God's return, his rule, his righteousness, but in a way that's got a little bit of bloodlust of kind of hoping that all the sinners around you sort of get theirs, if you will. They're even more legalistic than the Pharisees. So the Pharisees were kind of their liberal cousin, if you will. So for example, they refused to offer sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem because they saw it as being run by a corrupt priesthood. So they would not even do that. They tried to refrain from bowel movements on the Sabbath so that they could maintain ritual purity. We should all do the live like an Essene for a day. I'm just kidding. That sounds very unhealthy. I'm not a doctor, but that sounds very unhealthy. The next group are zealots. These are the guys that take matters in their own hands. They ascribe to a very violent form of resistance. They are very anti-Roman. They were very pro-guerrilla warfare. If you've been watching The Chosen, I love the episode where they sort of give us a very fancifully retold, very artfully retold backstory for Simon the Zealot. They actually show them plotting against, some ruler, and he's about to, they're about to do a hit in the street. And it shows them practicing in some village. It was very interesting to just go, I wonder what would that really have looked like to be one of these guys, and how did they train? When Jerusalem was surrounded by the Romans, close to AD 70, and like it turned into siege warfare situation. The Romans are trying to starve them out. The Jews had a great supply of food. The Zealots are the ones who burned the pile of food. They burned the storehouses. And part of it was to try to force the Jews to open the gates and go to open conflict with the Romans, because they thought, if we go to swords with the Romans, this is where God is going to come in. It'll be just like the days of Joshua. We're going to, like, I know the odds don't look great in our favor, but we're going to get them. If you read Josephus's Jewish Wars, it's like a circus scene where you have all of these disunified groups inside of Jerusalem, very corrupted groups inside of Jerusalem, each with their own agenda, each trying to do their own thing. It obviously ended very, very terribly. But these are the ones who wanted to burn the food and throw the gates open, like, let's go to swords, and God will fight on our side. He's gonna sort it out. These guys often committed assassinations in the New Testament against Romans and tax collectors and other collaborators. So Jesus has a tax collector and a zealot on his list of disciples, and they would walk around and eat and sleep together. Go on boats. There are lots of times to make something look like an accident. Having that set up sounds like a good recipe to have 11 disciples. But these guys would carry daggers in their long kind of Middle Eastern style cloaks, and in a crowd of people. You remember Zacchaeus didn't want to get down into the crowd of people. It wasn't just he wanted to be in the tree because he was short. It's also he doesn't want to be where he can't be seen, and somebody could just come up and knife him, and that would be that. And so the story actually has a bit of a terrifying moment where Jesus walks up and calls attention. He's sort of trying to see without getting treed, if you will. But yeah, that's who the Zealots were. Scribes. These are a professional class. They're not exactly a sect, although lots of times they are thrown in linguistically, scribes and Pharisees, in a sentence in the New Testament. And so it's likely that they might have had a bit of a crossover. We think in today's world of, everyone being literate, everyone being able to write, but actually someone who could write and who could read, especially if it was in more than one language. This was a very professional kind of person. They often were either hired out for religious work or were conscripted, i.e. enslaved, in a wealthy person's home who needed to send a lot of correspondence. But the average person couldn't read or write, and so this was a professional writing class of people. And then finally, the Sanhedrin. The Romans permitted the Jews to have essentially a local court to settle religious disputes. Nobody from the Roman side wanted to be over what they called Palestine at the time. It was like the Wild West. You had all of these groups that each hated each other, but they all hated you. It's kind of like your final stop, and where you're given a chance to fail one last time. And so nobody really wanted to be over this, which is actually why Herod was popular with the Romans, as he kind of promised his ability as a near Jew who shared their hatred of Jews to be able to control and manipulate, and that's kind of why they were interested in him, is it added one layer of deniability, I think, for them. All right, so I want to kind of hone in. That's sort of just broad picture of what was the first century world like. If you want more than that, join me on a trip. But let's look a little bit at the book of Matthew. So the Gospels in general, these are written by eyewitnesses or according to eyewitness accounts. So here we have the words of Luke 1, and as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. And so Luke is saying, look, there's some eyewitness language being used here. The Gospels largely focus on the 3 years of Jesus' life beginning around AD 30. And so those 3 years of his ministry, you've probably heard me say this before, there's a year of obscurity, a year of popularity, and a year of rejection. And so Jesus kind of starts out where nobody knows him, both geographically and just socially, where nobody really knows who he is. And then because they realize, wow, this guy can do these amazing deeds, the crowds swell. And then as the crowds swell, a lot of political eyes and religious eyes are put on him and his disciples, and scrutiny and criticism come because of this. And then this is the year of rejection, which winds up ending in his death. In two of the Gospels, we get birth narratives, in Matthew and in Luke. John starts his own way. which we get kind of an origin story, but it's much more philosophical than it is a story about the birth. I don't want to spend too much time talking about what scholars call the synoptic gospels. And so the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where John is kind of the outlier. And so they see these three sharing similar stories, tons and tons and tons of stories, studies, dissertations, books have been written about that topic alone. Who is sharing from who, which stories are unique to which authors, or if you're ever reading a commentary, a lot of them will say, well, this story is in this and this gospel, but not that one, or we think this author borrowed from that one. Into this theory, people say, well, there's this Q document, which we don't have and is not referenced outside of dissertations or reviews of dissertations. But there's this Q document, and then there's the Mark document, and there's all of these documents that then the people compiled. This is the stuff dissertations are made of. It's fascinating to read. It could be how it happened. It also doesn't have to be how it happened. It doesn't change the story at all, in my opinion. So anyway, no more about that. The author of Matthew is actually, this is an unattributed gospel. Unlike Luke, who names himself, John doesn't really attribute, at least not at the beginning. You know, he references himself creatively a number of times. But this one really doesn't have any kind of title. A lot of early church tradition says that it was Matthew. In fact, they were unanimous that it was Matthew. So tradition ascribes this to Matthew. Some think that he only wrote a book called the Oracles. But the word oracles in Aramaic to early Greek, which the early church fathers were writing in, doesn't always translate. Like there's more than one way to translate that. So it could mean oracle. It could also mean like the story of or the gospel of. You know, so the people who were taking that approach say, well, he wrote the oracles of Jesus, and then somebody else took his oracles and Q document and 5 other things, and then they compiled this later. It's relatively unimportant distinction, but I would just say all of the early church writers attributed this to Matthew. And then when you look at the book itself, you go, okay, well, what do we know of Matthew? Let's just inspect that for ourselves. Matthew is a tax collector, which we see as kind of a sleazy, grabby, a schmuck, if you will. But the reality is he would have been a Roman representative in a political office who works with numbers and math and finance and law. So probably a pretty educated person, probably a pretty organized person. So if you look at the organization of Matthew, it's very organized. I'll get into its organization in a moment. Also, there's certain specific references of Jesus paying a temple tax where the other gospels aren't as interested in taxes. Like if you're not a tax person, none of us are either. And so, but the fact that Matthew includes this means probably this might be a hint that it's him. Matthew's account of his call to being a disciple uses his name Matthew rather than Levi, and so it's kind of a little bit more of a personal term. So that might be another hint. And when referencing the story of Jesus going into Matthew's house, he omits his house from it. So Luke and Mark say he went into Matthew's house. He uses the language of his house, like in a second person kind of way, and the Gospel of Matthew has a little bit more first person kind of reference there. So again, it's not a claim of authorship, but it's a pretty good indicator. All of these details, when you put them together, you go, okay, this kind of supports what the early church said, which Matthew is the author. The audience is believed to be Jewish Christians. So people who were from a Jewish background, both ethnically and religiously, who had just converted into Christianity and had either just broken from Judaism or were about to break from Judaism. And so it's kind of written then as a handbook. Gundry says it's written as a handbook for a mixed church under persecution. So there's a lot of pro-Jewish themes. There's a lot of references to Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, for instance, or just certain things that he did it in a way that were prescriptively Jewish. And then on the other hand, there's a demonstration, a consistent demonstration of Jesus' conflict with the religious leaders and other Jewish leaders at the time. And so they're saying, well, you can kind of see that. We do know from the book of Acts that the early church starts in Jerusalem, and it says they met in the synagogue and house to house daily. And so early Christianity was kind of this combination. It was not an immediate split from the temple or from the synagogue. At some point when Christianity became its own thing and the Jews essentially said, hey, this is not our thing, that is when we see Christianity moving away from Judaism and Judaism moving away from Christianity. And so perhaps this is Matthew's writing at the time when this kind of divide is taking place or has just taken place. And so there's a lot in this book that talks about discipleship, talks about humility, talks about forgiveness. How do we live in light of this new kingdom thinking? There's a lot of parables of the kingdom in the book of Matthew. There's even allusions to certain offices in the church. This is the only gospel actually to use the word church, to use ecclesia. Of the four gospels, the other three don't. And people say, well, that's because the church isn't formed until Acts. And yet we have Matthew talking and using this word. In fact, uses it 3 times in his book. So you could see this kind of as an inoculation to persecution, or just trying to help people understand Jesus went through persecution and the disciples went through persecution. You are going to go through this as well. This is actually very practical for believers in countries where it's not legal to convert out of your home religion into Christianity, is just this understanding that actually persecution is normal. One of the major features of the book that people focus in on is just the messianic nature of Jesus, how he fulfilled all of these prophecies and such, or just how he is cast as kind of the new Moses. So we're not going to read all of these for the sake of time, but we'll just compare a couple. Matthew 2:13 says, now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. Exodus 2:15, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled. So there's a bit of a parallel and an overlay. And you go, okay, well, that's one example. Well, there's a second one. Matthew 2:20, saying, rise, take the child and his mother, go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother, and he went to the land of Israel. Exodus 4:19, and the Lord said to Moses and Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons, and with them had them ride on a donkey, and he went back to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the staff of God in his hand. There's more references here if you're interested, but suffice it to say, Matthew really focuses on the fulfillments of how does Jesus fulfill the Old Testament. So you'll see that line again and again and again. This was done so to fulfill what the prophets had said, and then they quote the prophets. So there's that constant portrayal of Jesus as the kind of new and better Moses, and his interactions there. One of the things that's really fascinating is the structure of the book. Now, some people make too much of this, but essentially, there's 5 major discourses. Starts with the Sermon on the Mount. Everybody's familiar with that one. The commissioning of the 12, the parables of the kingdom, a whole chapter of parables of the kingdom. There's a chapter on humility and forgiveness, and then the Olivet Discourse. Are there any other sections of the Bible that are made up of a group of 5? Pentateuch, yeah. Penta means 5. And so again, Matthew is writing. Again, we see the tax collectors as these faithless, sleazy people, and perhaps they were. On the other hand, Matthew would have been educated. He would have been intelligent, even if he might not have been a faithful Jew in the sense of rejecting Rome and its influence. He would have been the most likely of all of them to have remembered what was taught in school to him as a child. I mean, who do we have? We have Peter and his brothers. What is their day job? Fishermen. So, you know, no pun intended, but do the math. Who are you going to bank on, to win the Bible quiz? Well, it's probably the kid that's really, really smart, kind of in his whole life, not the guys who just fish and fish and fish. So there's this even kind of structural allusion, some would say, just to this kind of comparison to Judaism, where Matthew is comparing Jesus to Moses on a number of fronts, and then you see there's kind of, the book is divided into 5 major speeches or discourses. So it's an interesting hypothesis, but I agree with authors who say we can also make too much of that kind of thing. So who is Jesus portrayed as in the Gospel of Matthew? Number one is he's portrayed as the Lord himself. We see this in certain terms or in certain phrases that are used about him, where he is hinted at or alluded to as kind of being God. We see certain references to him being the servant of the Lord, or the suffering servant, from Isaiah. We see where he is compared with the Son of Man from Daniel. Again, the Son of Man from Daniel is a very divine, a very messianic category that Matthew puts onto Jesus through his gospel. He's the climax of the line of the law and the prophets. We see this in a couple of places. We see this in the Transfiguration, and when he is transfigured with the 2 characters that represent the law and the prophets. We see this also just from the genealogy of chapter 1, where there's all of these, this whole line leads up to, and then there's Jesus. Matthew gives us 3 sets of 14, 14 from the patriarchs to deportation, then from no, I'm missing one step. It's late, I'm sorry. Anyway, he gives us 3 sets of 14. So we see that he's kind of presented as the climax in the line of the law of the prophets. Chapter 1, the birth narrative, also tells us that he's Emmanuel. He's God with us. This is super rich with Old Testament imagery, with messianic imagery. So the structure of the sermon series, I have timed it where the birth section is going to fall on Christmas time. So I want it noted. I know I'm not the most Christmassy person, but we started with the Word became flesh today, right? And so the next week we get into there's like 3 or 4 Christmas sermons this month. So I just credit me later when that doesn't happen again. But Emmanuel, God with us, very rich in Old Testament, messianic, and divine imagery. And then the book presents him just again and again as the new and greater Moses. Think of the feeding of the 5,000. Who else made bread appear in the wilderness? Yeah, God, Moses. It's a divine miracle that everyone is so familiar with. And the feeding of the 5,000, you've got Jesus out there in the wilderness. He makes them all sit out, and then the loaves and the fishes he turns into a feeding time. So there's so many examples where Jesus does that kind of thing, and Matthew is certainly tipping the hat that he's the new and greater Moses. Again, which a very Jewish audience interest for us. All right, any questions or comments? We can chat about it. Christy also told me I cut it off too short last time, but I'm trying to be respectful of everybody's time. Tom?
Question. Is Aramaic and Hebrew very close?
Very, very close. Sorry, we need to do the microphone, sorry.
Should I ask again?
Yes, yeah, go ahead and ask again.
Is Aramaic and Hebrew very close languages?
They are. So all of the Semitic languages are very close. They all have triconsonantal roots, so 3 consonants in the root of the word. They all have prefixes and suffixes. Even linguistically, they sound somewhat similar, that if you just slow it down and listen and think about the words, you can kind of understand. So my Arabic is much stronger than my Hebrew, and sorry to call Amber out, but Amber was showing me her Hebrew notebook, and there's some word which in my brain I'm looking at that going, I don't know how to say that in Hebrew, but I know how to say that in Arabic, and it helped me think through what was the word because the consonants were the same. Is there a reason why you're asking that?
No, the thought came in while you were talking about the languages.
Okay. Based on that question, though, you go, well, if the languages are very similar, the loss of language and the loss of meaning in the text, is that really that big of a deal? And the problem with Hebrew is the Old Testament is written over, depending on how you date everything, like centuries. And you think of English changing over. I mean, I showed you Bibles that were from the 1500s, which historically speaking is not really that old. And we looked at the pages and we couldn't read what it was because Middle English, though, is super near to modern English. It's impossible for us. I mean, I'm sure a linguist could go, oh, look, it's so easy. This means this. And I mean, they could show us all the connections. But the non-linguists in the room, it just looks like German, honestly.
Do we have much, so the silent period, 400 years, do we have much documentation on, so there was a ton of messiahs, right? Mm-hmm. You know, they come and go. In Acts, Gamaliel refers to that, mm-hmm. you know, a little bit, saying, hey, we've seen people come and go, and if it's of man, it'll peter out, it doesn't matter. If it's of mm-hmm. God, it doesn't matter what we do. We'll have to follow it anyways. But do we have much in the way of documentation of that period besides like 1st, 2nd Maccabees, which is a fairly specific event?
Yeah, not really. Most of our information would be from Maccabees and from Josephus. Okay. There might be a few other references outside of that, but I'm trying to think if Philo talks about that. I don't really know. I haven't read as much Philo. He might be a third source, perhaps, but again, I'm guessing there.
We get the impression, though, that there was a cycle of leaders fall, leader fall, sure. as there were all these fake messiahs.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Jesus says this, like in the last days, there's going to be all these people, or there's just going to be rumors of like, hey, he's here, he's there, and Jesus basically says, you'll know. You'll know when it's happening. It won't be this curious, suspicious thing.
So in your preparation for sermon series in Matthew, did you find that you needed to refer to any of the other Gospels for areas of specific topics or specific doctrine?
So that's a fascinating question, and this relates kind of to methodology. One approach to teaching about the life of Jesus is to teach it as a harmony of the Gospels. So we take particularly the synoptic Gospels because they are very focused on and kind of arranged similarly. We take those and we sort of summarize. I am decidedly not doing that. So I'm intentionally going, what was Matthew himself saying as Matthew? You're going to feel this probably the hardest on Christmas Eve. I don't want to spill too much there, but if you just wanted to look ahead on your own, just look at Matthew and look at Luke and go, if all I had was Matthew, what would I know? And I mean, we had this conversation as a creative team going, okay, for Christmas Eve, do we sort of scratch people's need to get the whole story, or do we just follow Matthew? And as a team, we collectively went, we're just going to follow Matthew. And it's going to be different because Matthew handles the birth narrative very differently. So I don't think it's wrong to take the harmony approach, and I think certain Gospels fill in other stories that we don't have from the life of Jesus, but they're doing it for a purpose. Like John is writing his Gospel, he says, so that you will believe. Like that's why it's written. And he has a very kind of polemical, even ironic style that he writes in. And he kind of presents in a sight. If you were to read John once a day for a month or something, you would start seeing this pattern where Jesus goes to a town, teaches something, people challenge the teaching, he gives a sign, they try to kill him, he moves to the next town. John is doing something there, right? He's showing Jesus as the truth. You see certain unique features like the I am statements and that kind of thing. So I would say each gospel has its unique peculiarities, and some people like to harmonize that, and I'm just going to focus on Matthew. Youth pastor's raising his hand with a smile.
It's dangerous because it's a personal question. So
Okay.
I hope I don't get in trouble. Do you have
I think you start personal questions with, I'm asking for a friend.
Hey, I'm asking for a friend. I'm asking for Anders. Do you have a favorite gospel, and is there a reason why you picked Matthew out of the 4? It's a double whammy.
Gosh, I don't know. Do I have a favorite gospel? I like Matthew and Luke because of the kind of first century cultural depiction that we get, right? So I love John, just to read and talk about the kind of snappiness of the stories. Mark he's not my favorite gospel. It's just kind of short and, I mean, to the point, which is a different audience. So I prefer Matthew and Luke. And when I find myself wanting to use a Jesus story, I wind up typically in one of those two books. Kind of, so I guess that would be the short answer, is those would probably be my favorite gospels. But for me, my hope is that we just spend, as a church, just spend a long, protracted time looking at the life of Jesus. I think there's a lot of times when in leadership we think, how do we motivate people to get engaged, to do something? And there's lots of, some of it is communicating, getting the word out, Sometimes it's an administrative fix, but sometimes a lot of churches will kind of get a little bit arm twisty about trying to just manipulate and cajole everybody into everything. And I think sometimes we really need to reconnect people with Jesus in a deeper way. And so when I was doing mission work and trying to raise funds, I would tell, if I was meeting with a pastor, I'd say, hey, look, I'm not asking you to fill the room with everybody. I don't want everybody in the room. In fact, they don't have to have a heart for missions. They don't have to have a heart for Muslims. So who are the people who just really love Jesus in your church? Those are the people I want to talk to. And I might get it was always fascinating to see which people he would put in the room with that request. But that's who I wanted to talk to. And so I think, well, okay, collectively, we're leading a body here. And how do we help people love Jesus more? Because whatever God calls us to do next, it has to be built out of that foundation of love for Jesus, not a desire to grow. I mean, there's some good elements of that, or a desire to just get bigger for bigger. So there's all these kind of false desires, and I think whatever God calls us to, the strongest foundation is looking more like Jesus.
I'm not sure how to ask this succinctly, but just as you were talking about Matthew and just about the Jewish audience, why do you think that then so many Jewish people did not believe, and today, how do they look? I know they're not a monolith, but how do they look at the New Testament and the life of Christ?
That's a good question, and I would say there's a lot of complexity on both sides, but I would say there's similarity on both sides. I think for a lot of Jews, it comes down to who is the Messiah, and a dying Messiah is an oxymoron to how most people define a Messiah. And so if you look at the Messianic passages, particularly the ones like Psalm 2, that God is going to make the nations a footstool for his inheritance, that he's going to dash the nations with a rod of iron. Jesus didn't do this. And so if you can't say, well, with prophecy, there's there's two moments, but we're seeing it this way, so it looks like one thing, but if we could have this side perspective, we go, okay, there's this part and there's this part. If you can't separate that, you just go, yeah, Jesus didn't do this. I think with that comes a lot of emotion, a lot of hurt. We could look in the modern times to things like the Holocaust. If there really is a God, why did he allow this to happen? But we could look at, first century persecution of Jews by Romans. And it was a similar kind of thing where there were Jewish martyrs who were killed by the Romans, or 100 years BC, there were Jews who were killed by, it's just like different groups have killed them over the years. And I think it kind of goes to what I was talking about this morning in the sermon, where I said, look, God is calling us to believe. That might be a belief for the first time, but for those of us who've been in the church a long time, chances are we've been hurt, and that hurt even though intellectually we would say, I know God exists, there's this emotional component where we can't just open ourselves and release ourselves to him anymore. There's kind of this callousing and this protecting. There's a part in Chronicles of Narnia where the kids are talking about Aslan the lion, and they say, is he safe? And the answer is no, but he's good. And it's easy to sit there and we go emotionally, we go, yes, that's what we're saying about God. He's not safe, but he's good, which is great. But if you're one of the people at Masada, when the Romans are stacking up and about to come in and kill everybody, and for a brief moment, there was one moment where the ramparts that they had built to get up that the Romans had built to kind of invade caught fire. And of course, every zealous Jew is going, all right, it's happening. Here it is. And obviously, we know from history that's not the way the story ended. It was just this brief moment where it caught fire, and then the whole thing backfired on them, and they all died anyway. And so if you look at a lot of Jewish history, there's just a lot of sadness to it, and that just increases over time. So I think a lot of it relates to, can we... And I hear this from non-Jews as well. I can't serve a God who blah, blah, blah. And so I think it's that feeling of abandonment. We look at the generations who saw Jesus coming. I keep referencing The Chosen. I just got into it a bit late. I'm late to that party. But I've just really, really enjoyed it. And one of my favorite characters is Nicodemus, because you can see him kind of being rational and wants to try to figure things out. On the other hand, you just see this, but if this really is the Messiah, and there's just this expectant, excited hopefulness about him. And the actor just does an amazing job portraying that. That's hard for us to feel that way when it seems like so much silence. So that would kind of be I don't know if that's even really an answer, but I just think there's a lot of sort of emotional or existential angst that's filled up in the reason why. Why not? All right. Is everybody questioned out? All right. Thank you so much for coming. I've really enjoyed these 4 nights, and I'm not sure what the takeaway is, because I know some people have rearranged life group schedules and all of that, and I don't want to, we really are trying to get life groups off the ground and being a central, not just off the ground, but them being a central thing of what we are doing as a church and as a ministry. And, it's one part training strategy, it's one part outreach strategy. Life groups it's this multifaceted thing, the way that Steve and I think about it. On the other hand, I do think these nights have been kind of helpful for certain reasons. And so I've been thinking about maybe doing some summer stuff when the life groups are not meeting. So just keep your ears open for some of that. Also, a serious invite, if you haven't talked about it or considered it, take a look at the flyer for the Turkey trip. I would love to, we have plenty of room. I'd love to have a good group of Mountain View folks on that. It's a lot of fun. We had a blast on the Israel trip, lots of good bonding experiences and just very interesting information. So you get to kind of see these places. I know, I've done this kind of study my whole life, and last year, to be able, or earlier this year rather, to be able to stand there and go, okay, I see it now. Intellectually, I had it for the longest time of going, okay, I get it. There's this group and this group and this group, and this is how it all boiled down. But to actually be physically in the space and go, wow, they were, the group and the group you're told not to marry into, it's like here to downtown Snohomish. It's not far. You look at the map, you're like, oh, that's way over there. No, it's not. It's it's the next neighborhood over. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and see you Sunday.